Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. On this episode, I'm exploring something that fascinates me. It's a location in which I spend a lot of my time, and that is museums. They're places that stimulate creativity, teach me things I'd never otherwise know, and shape the way that I think about the world. So whether I'm in London or Munich, the two places I spend most of my time in, or indeed anywhere else, I make a habit of visiting museums, not just for what's inside them, but for how they create memorable and meaningful experiences. So I thought it would be an interesting idea to speak to someone who really understands how museums work, not just as places full of objects or venues that sell tickets, but as carefully designed spaces that shape how we feel and interact with history, culture, and ideas. My guest on this episode is Matthew McNerney. He's the Chief Creative Officer of Luci Creative, a firm that designs museum and brand experiences. Matthew has worked on everything from the Lego house in Billund, Denmark, to presidential libraries, science museums, and the NASCAR Hall of Fame. In our conversation, we explore the psychology of museum design, how to create exhibits that spark curiosity, and why some experiences stay with us for life, while others are instantly forgotten. We discuss the challenges museums are facing today, how to get people through the doors, how to balance education with entertainment, and what makes a great museum experience truly unforgettable. So if you've ever been inspired by a museum visit or wondered why some are more engaging than others, you're going to really enjoy this experience. Matthew is incredibly entertaining to speak to. He's someone that just has an amazing job. This was such a pleasure to record, and I think you're going to really enjoy it. It's my discussion with Matthew McNerney on museum design. Matthew, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Thank you.
I'm so excited to have you here. I'm particularly excited because listeners won't be able to see this, but I can. You're wearing a hat and I'm not, which feels massively off-brand for me, but I'm delighted that you've joined into the spirit of the exercise. So with that in mind, tell my listeners a little bit about yourself.
My name is Matthew McNerney. I am the Chief Creative Officer of Luci, which is a museum and brand experience design firm. And we sort of work at the intersection of curiosity and change, I would say.
And how does one get into doing that?
It was actually a career that I did not know even existed. I was in college at a period where there was tremendous upheaval within the brand world. And I was an art major studying at Pratt Institute. And the curriculum was built that you had to do advertising, illustration, graphic design, industrial design. You had to touch a little bit of everything. And this was the years of Callie Lazin's Adbusters, Naomi Klein's No Logo. It was clear that a lot of brands were sort of commodifying dissent and figuring out how to turn it into a brand. And I was kind of just angry at the world, and I didn't really see like where there were opportunities for me to do my thing. And I had this crazy idea. I was like, I'm going to be completely neutral as a designer. I'm going to design textbooks. And good Lord, what a terrible idea that would have been. Especially given the rate of change of the design world. But I had an amazing design professor, Michael McGinn, genius. And he started us exploring a lot of different other forms of communication. He gave me this incredible book by Ralph Kaplan called By Design, who argued that the greatest design invention of the 20th century was the sit-in protest. And it was kind of one of these moments of like head blowing open, because I would never consider that a design. But when he broke down the psychology of how it interrupted the mechanisms of the functioning world, it kind of blew open my whole, world. And so we started exploring that. This was also September 11th. There was a lot of political sort of dissent of understanding how to move forward. So our professor started having us design protests, which I thought was amazing. And
Cool.
yeah, he was a genius. I'm so close to him to this day. I owe him my career. But I interpreted this. I figured out, how do I commodify this? And I came to him one day super proud. And I said, I'm going to be a wedding designer. And he was like, what? I was like, yeah, like these rituals and shaping time and creating these spaces. And I love it. It's people, it's energy. He was like, that's a horrible idea. I was like, why?
You've missed the point.
Everything is like right out the window, right? I failed as a teacher. But he said, first of all, it's the most stressful day of people's lives. Why would you want to permanently exist in that world? He was like, secondly, anyone who could even hire someone under the lens of wedding designer is going to be incredibly wealthy, which means it's going to come with all kinds of baggage and expectations that you're not ready to handle. He was like, why don't you just go design museums? And I was like, that's a thing? And I owe him my life. He wrote an email introducing me to Deborah Wolf, who was the head of the chief of staff at Ralph Applebaum Associates at the time, got a internship and never looked back. And it actually got to the point where I was still in school and a new project opened. And the head of HR came to me and said, look, there's a new opportunity. We want to give it to you, but we either have to have you drop out of college and take the job, or we're hiring someone else. So I came to the chair of my department and I said, look, like I had this opportunity. This was right after the dot-com boom. Terrible. There's no job market. He signed my papers and let me walk. I graduated without ever finishing school and I never looked back. So yeah, it's kind of a crazy journey. And I've been in the museum world for over 20 years with a brief stint back into the brand world begrudgingly. Because when I found out I was going to be a father, I felt like, wait, I need to make money now. Like I need to be able to provide. And that was incredibly illuminating, incredible experience. But this world, this sort of cultural landscape is what gets me really excited.
Wow. You can just tell from the way I mean, clearly you don't make that decision to go do that guy, regardless of the job market, right? You wouldn't do
Yeah.
that unless it really spoke to you. And I
Yeah.
love that. I love the pivot
Yes.
from weddings to museums. That's awesome. But what does it actually involve? So if I think about, I go to a museum,
Yeah.
but what do you, so this is looking at it really saying, how do we make this more, I guess you're trying to get more visitors through the door, right? Make it a better experience. Is that the way to look at it?
That's certainly one of the success metrics you might look at. I think that there's so much going on. There was a gorgeous, gorgeous article written a couple of years ago in the New York Times about a new slavery museum that opened up. And the journalist said something along the lines of that museums are spaces where we can collectively wrestle with topics that are too complicated to sort of process individually. And for me, that just was the most poetic way of capturing why I'm in this business and why I think that the sort of legion of people who are in this world, and it really is a self-chosen world, recognizes that museums are places that preserve generational wisdom, kind of fill in gaps where the education system may fall short, create spaces for public conversation, expose you to concepts that are way bigger than you'd ever sort of expose yourself in other ways. And like, that's what makes me love this world. And I think that to bring my son now into these spaces and see him come alive and engage with science topics or art topics or, just it's a really special place that doesn't really exist much in the world outside of that. And so I think that if you ask what I do, museum exhibit designers, experience designers sort of reconcile what a client's trying to communicate and trying to do with the complexity of human experience and recognize that there are hundreds of mechanisms you can pull to bridge that gap. So you've got media, you've got signage, you've got architectural lighting, materials, sound design, smell, all the senses, right? You've got the sense of pacing or compression of space and claustrophobia and all of the things that sort of we experience in the world. You can actually manipulate those. You can dial them in to evoke reactions, emotions, prompts. And so we sort of get the ingredients and we look at how to cook them into something that is as effective as possible for what happens. And there's so many different ways of doing it. And that's what's so delightful. And it's so rooted to the content that you can never recreate it anywhere else.
I presume that what the museum is there to do is generally fixed. And you're then brought in, I guess, everything from initially, here's a new one that we're designing through to we want you to overhaul it, revamp, whatever you want to call
Right.
it. It's
Right.
all of those things, I presume. And you're looking and saying, how do we take this theme, idea, content, and then transform that into something, well, that enhances it, right? That takes it further. If it's something that's already there,
Exactly.
it makes it more amazing, I guess.
For sure. I would say, makes it visceral and unforgettable if we're doing our jobs correctly. Yeah, at least in the way we see it at Lucy. Yeah.
And so what sort of give us an example of the kinds of I mean, I did clearly based on the
Yeah.
description, it's any museum, right? I guess pretty much.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
what sort of things do you work on?
I've done everything from presidential libraries to the NASCAR Hall of Fame to the Lego house in Denmark. I worked on a Jewish museum in Moscow, which feels particularly potent at the time. I have created fun experiences that are just delightful, like little Instagrammy pop-up things. On the brand side, I've done the New Balance new, inline store that's being rolled out around the world. Worked for you name it, I've done it. It's delightfully broad in its context, and worked at a science museum for the Frost Science Museum in Miami. We're doing all kinds of stuff. It's really yeah.
And so really, when I start to think about all the museums I've been to,
Yeah,
the ones I've been to under duress as a kid, but the ones I've also chosen to go to as an adult, I
sure.
mean, that covers, it was interesting you mentioned brands there as well, because there
Yeah,
is that. Oh, aside from, I'm having flashbacks now. So as a kid, the ones I hated, where let's get to the store at the end of it, right? Because I can spend some money. But actually,
exit to a gift shop.
there's an interesting overlap there between retail, museum, and those things. So really fascinating because although it's a specialism, as you point out,
Yeah.
it's really broad, right? What you could be asked to do
Yes.
could encompass a whole range of different things, and therefore, I guess, human emotions, physical spaces, locations. That's a
Yeah.
huge amount of it. It's not like you're shop fitting, right? Where you've got a roughly
No.
idea they're going to put it in these locations, and therefore we need to. It could be. I mean, it could be a whole range of things, and so that's quite a broad. I guess it's
Yeah.
fascinating from a sort of artistic, but creative perspective, right? It's a pretty broad
It's
canvas of things you could be asked to look at.
it guarantees the two things. I am always learning. It's a lifelong learning position. It's a guaranteed apprenticeship model for anyone who joins this career because there's so much to sort of unpack and learn. And it's utterly delightful because you're constantly exploring the unknown and the possible and cross-pollinating from wisdom across other solutions that you can find.
And so how does it work in terms of you will get, and I'm guessing it could be anything from an exhibit to a complete museum or parts of a museum. So you've really got to get your head around what's the mission of the museum? What are they here to do?
Mhm.
And then what are they trying to do? And
Sure.
therefore, how can we elevate that and build on it? So how do you even start that?
I mean, some clients have very clear understandings. We're working with a client right now that's very interested in taking their history exhibits and doing sort of a history from below, Howard Zinn kind of understanding the state's history through the lens of a common person, right? So that's easy. You can dive right in. It's not easy at all, actually, but
It's
but
really challenging.
it's a clear mission, right? I think others are more open ended and because they're interested in unlocking new demographics or enhancing community outreach or sharing a new message, it takes a little bit more interrogation and provocation to arrive at a trajectory.
And so you've really got to put yourself in the shoes of the visitor, right? And I'm assuming literally, right? Walk through it, work out what's there, think about those things, and that will involve you doing, I guess, going to museums you wouldn't naturally go to. I'm assuming to a certain extent you will go visit things just for inspiration purposes that you might not otherwise visit,
Yeah.
but you could be looking at something that wouldn't normally be something that will grab your attention.
Hmm.
And so you're then wandering through and I guess trying to think about things from the perspective of that museum visitor or the potential museum visitor.
Yes. I am plagued with forever. Every vacation is a busman's holiday. I live in museums weekdays and weekends. My son thinks that the only thing you can do on the weekends is go to museums. It's my life and it's a joy. And you're correct. You constantly need inspiration. I would say inspiration from everything. It's not just sort of a captured audience there. But the challenge of understanding the visitor is forever changing because the landscape of culture is always changing. And I think that it is Herculean in trying to tackle it because everyone brings a different agenda, different need state, which is what a sort of marketer or a consumer packaging person would sort of see it as, and a different level of intelligence or knowledge on the topic. So there's all kinds of codifications of museum visitors, and they sort of fall into these archetypes, and they're much more nuanced than the sort of blunt buckets of scanner, stroller, studier, socializer, right? You got to have the alliteration, or swimmer, waiter, like you name it. There's all kinds of different, poetic frames of this. But what it does hint at is that unlike a brand like Nike, who knows its demographic down to the minutia, has all the data points, can market to that specific lens, museums don't know who's walking in the door. Is it a local? Is it a tourist? Is it someone who's an expert on dinosaurs, who's actively looking for like the one thing that we got wrong so they could blow up the comments feed in their in social media to say that they knew better? Or is it someone who's just delighted on discovering this for the first time? And so creating the infrastructure to meet people where they are is overwhelming and constantly evolving, and really the hard work of what the museum industry is facing right now, because museums live in this incredible tension between being respected as the most trusted institutions in the world over governments, over journalists, over the media, you name it, right? But also post pandemic, having plummeting attendance and not recovering that audience. So you kind of live in this world of you're respected, but you're not engaged with as much. And so that's bridge of how do we meet more visitors where they are, understanding all their different need states, is quite tricky.
Because it is interesting when you describe it in those terms, because I spend my time in Munich and London, both museum-rich cities,
Yeah.
and there's tons of them I've
Yes.
never been to. There's some that I go to, but I sort of love the fact that they're there. But if you said, "How much am I supporting them?"
Right.
I'd get very upset if they closed.
Hmm.
But actually, am I? And that's interesting because I think of myself. I generally am a person that goes to museums. But
Right.
it's when you talk about it in those terms, yeah, you're absolutely right. Is there is a pride in their existence, and a
Hmm.
kind of like you walk past and you go, I live in a cultured, civilized place, right? Because these things
Absolutely.
exist. There
Yeah.
are some less cultured and less civilized ones, but let's focus on the high end.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But so that I think that's really interesting. The role that they play in society, and yet I can see completely, as you say, that particularly as we move, some of it's because things have moved online, some of it's because patterns post pandemic have changed. So that's a really interesting challenge. I guess the simple thing is how do you remain relevant? I guess.
Absolutely. And I think that, to your point of I respect it, but sometimes I choose not to go there. If you're not careful, they can run the risk of going the way of the ballet and the opera and all of these places that you respect because they're storied institutions, but they become novelties in the broader sector, and sort of very specialized to those audiences and the outreach. I also think that there's something also you pointed out in terms of I have limited time. What am I going to do on my weekend? One of my mentors, Alistair Lennox, genius, really, really brilliant, came from the brand world. He was so astute at saying, for people in their lanes, right? I'm in the museum lane. You start getting this tunnel vision of thinking that, okay, I have $10 in my pocket. Am I going to go to the Museum of Modern Art or the Whitney? But that's not what's happening in people's brains. What's happening is I have $10. What do I want to do? Is it a movie? Is it a museum? Is it an arcade? Is it a nightclub? Is it so you're not competing with museums, you're competing with free time in the same way that Netflix thinks they're competing with sleep, like it's not an A to A correlation, And so once you look at that, especially with an American culture, you recognize that museums really need to adapt to meet visitors in very new ways.
And that's super interesting because you're right. It's no longer about a physical location. So money plays a part. Where you are plays a part. I guess attention plays a part.
Mhm.
Um, So as you start to look at it, I mean, this is quite complex and multifaceted. So on the one hand, huge
Yeah.
opportunity. If I was looking
Right.
positively at the thing, you'd sort of go, that means you can play with lots of dynamics.
Hmm.
The flip side is it's a lot tougher than it might initially seem.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. I think that the two things there are you always have a client, right? And this is a business where the client usually is a subject matter expert. And that is the real challenge because they understand the topic already. And sometimes you're so close to it, you take for granted how abstract it is for a broader audience. We have a slide I've used in past presentations in my career that said we are 51% on the side of your visitor and 49% on the side of you. And it's important because, like, you're writing our checks, but we don't work for you. We work for your visitor, and that's a challenging, thing to bridge. But I do think, yes, you're absolutely correct. Having more tools in your toolbox to play with to meet audiences is delightful.
And at that point around expert knowledge,
Hmm.
that I mean, there's the behavioral science term, the curse of knowledge, right? The more you know, the
Sure.
harder it is to put yourself in a position of not knowing.
Right. You're
And I guess that
accountable audience.
also, I'd never thought about this before, but I guess there's also the sort of the curse of passion, where
Hmm.
clearly if you're gonna work for, I don't know, an archaeological museum or an art museum, you've got to have some interest in the subject to be good at your job.
Hmm.
I mean, you could potentially argue maybe for things like security, it might be a good idea if they didn't want to be there, right? Because then they're not
Right.
distracted, right? So there's I could see certain roles you might want the opposite thing, but generally speaking, if you're running these things, designing them, you're going to want to live with that. So I guess there's the subject matter expert thing, but there's also a natural presumption this will be of interest, right? Because
Hmm.
because that's how I've chosen my job. So as I think about the
Yeah.
behavioral dynamics here, is
Yeah.
not just thinking creatively, bringing alternative perspectives. It's helping people who are steeped in this stuff, who live this
Right.
stuff day in, day out, who love it,
Hmm.
to think through the shoes of course, there to your point around the dinosaur geek that's gonna come in,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
other hobbies are available, but you've gotta kind of you understand that, but then you also have to understand that broader audience, and so I think that's fascinating to how does one unencumber people for whom well, obviously, this is gonna be interesting and exciting and relevant and all those
Right.
things. How do you put them in a that's a huge challenge, I guess.
Well, I love this comment you made about the passion curse because what I think is unexpected is I would argue I would choose if I had the painful like sever the baby in half, which side do you pick? I would pick the passion over the knowledge. Because passion is contagious, and there's nothing more amazing than seeing someone geek out over their train collection or their Lego toys or whatever, like, there's just something magical about falling in love with something deeply, and the other side of that is information is commoditized. I can get anything I need right now from a museum on my iPhone, through ChatGPT, through Wikipedia, so, you're not going there for the content, you're going there for the magic. And so I think you hit on something fantastic. If you can bottle the lightning of why these people got into this business in the first place, it would be a much more successful experience than if you put a encyclopedia on the wall and said, "Look at all this stuff," right? Which sometimes we fall prey to.
And it is interesting because it's not a if I thought about going to a museum within the context of what you just said, it's potentially not a rational choice.
Yeah,
Because if I really wanna learn about stuff, then I can do that on the internet. I can research or I
right.
can read books or whatever. I don't need to go to physical location to
Mhm.
discover dinosaurs, right? So I go there to be wowed or to be amazed or to have an experience of getting close up to something. But it's not necessarily about a transfer of knowledge, right? It's about having an experience. And that is a shift, I guess, because when these museums were originally, particularly the older ones, and originally set up, it's like the only place you can see X
Right.
is in a museum. The only way that's how we learn about these things.
The cabinet of curiosities
Yeah,
model.
and the one that always astonishes me is if I think about the Mona Lisa.
Mhm.
It is. If anybody has seen it, the one thing you remember is how disappointingly small it is. And yet, if you go to Paris, it would be weird if you didn't go to the Louvre, and it would be
Right.
weird if you went to the Louvre if you didn't see the Mona Lisa. And then you go there, and then everybody takes pictures of this thing.
Right.
which is, if I think about it, is insane because firstly, you're not going to get a high quality shot of it.
No,
Secondly, if
no.
you wanted a high quality shot, there's plenty of alternative options online in the
Will done.
postcard store. Well,
Right.
there's better ways to get that thing, and they're going to have to move it, right? Because there's so much demand to see this thing. So in the rest of the room, there are certainly in the room when I used to go see it when I lived in Paris, right? In the rest of the museum, there were way from my perspective, and I couldn't do any of the things that are in the Louvre to be absolutely clear, but
Okay.
there are way more impressive things to look at, and yet we focus on this tiny thing.
Right.
And then you go back to why do we focus on this tiny thing? Because once upon a time it was stolen. Right, and
Right.
they left it was one of those classic ones where they leave classic museum trick of leave the blank frame there. People come look at the blank space, and then afterwards it
Right.
becomes this. And probably, I guess there's artistic merit, but bottom line is that's why it's the most famous painting in the world, is because it's got
Right.
this history. So if you look at that, that is entirely dumb. It's
Mhm.
ridiculous. Why would I go and look at this thing? I get a much better view of it if I'm looking online. And
Right.
yeah, there's a buzz around, and that I
Right.
think plays exactly to your point about where it's almost like it's been. They understood that ages ago when they created buzz around it by leaving the empty frame on the wall. But
Right.
that's the sort of thing that you're doing because you don't go there to see what it looks like
No, no,
because
no.
it's famous.
Right. 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 No, I mean, what you're pointing at is you don't go to see it. You go because it's a well, you do go to see it, but it's a pilgrimage, right? You check it
Right.
off your bucket list and you take a picture that probably has 700 cell phones in it, like everyone holding up their selfie stick to be able to get the angle, because it's evidence that you were there. And that is a valid mechanism for making a choice to do something, right? You have to say that I witnessed it with my own eyes. So when I have the bad postcard hanging on my college dorm, I can say, I saw that thing. Um, but that is what we bring to the conversation, right? Everyone's got a different agenda when they come to these spaces. So one of my most illuminating stories is that my son is obsessed with animals. And so for spring, all things nature. And so for spring break, I was like, you know what? I'm going to bring him on the most epic trip ever. And I'm going to fly him down to the Everglades. We're going to go on airboats. We're going to have one-on-one encounters with you know, crocodiles and alligators, which apparently both live in the Everglades, the only place in the world they both live. He met capybaras. We got pictures with birds all over him. He had one-on-one encounters with these giant tortoises. And I'm hemorrhaging debt. And I'm like, just like you name it. And I'm like, look at me. I'm such a good father. And we're back on the plane ride home. And I said, so Marcel, what's your favorite memory of that trip? And he's like, playing video games. That's oh my goodness. And 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 what I failed to realize even as an experienced designer is that everyone's got a different agenda, right? Everyone's got a different thing. When I go to a museum with my son, I'm looking through the lens of he needs to learn something. He is looking through the lens of I want to have fun, I want to have agency, I want to create something. When my mother goes to a experience with us, she just wants the picture. I have to document this. I need to save this as a family memory. Everyone's got their thing and they're all valid. So getting that snapshot of the Mona Lisa is just as valid in terms of the experience design mechanism as the person who wants to just sit down at a bench and stare at it for an hour and pontificate what it was like for Leonardo to be in that moment painting it, right? They're both valid experiences. And if you don't create those entry points for that, things go sideways.
But I love that story because you've curated the perfect experience in theory,
Right,
right? The
right. In my
responsible parenting thing is right. I'm going to take him. Right, I know he likes this, right? So I'm going to take him to something amazing that is going to do that, and we're going to have an incredible time, and he's going to remember those bits of it. And of
yes.
course, you do. What I think is interesting about that is you don't know later in life, to the extent that there is a memory there. It may
Right,
well be that the video games have been forgotten, and that somehow
right,
you've planted
right.
some. So the short term, we have to look at these things longer and shorter term, which is an interesting question for museums because I could love
Mhm.
something. Something could happen that a visit that I thought was a bit meh suddenly becomes amazing because an interest has been sparked somewhere else. And so there's a longer term memory, a shorter term memory, and
Absolutely.
and
Yeah.
those sorts of things. But I think that is really interesting because it points to thinking about humans and recognizing that actually, in theory, it's not back to it's not logical.
Right.
it's emotional and it's
Right.
about what feels right in the moment. And I love the fact it's a kind of a loaded question, right? Because
Yeah.
you sort of, if you'd given him a multiple choice, which of the animals did you most like?
Right. Right. Yeah.
You could have constrained the answer to something that would
Let
have
the
made you
witness
feel
will
good,
be. Yeah.
but that's not the point, right? You're asking an
Yeah.
open question because you want an honest answer.
Sure.
And so I love, as we think about behavioral dynamics of what you're looking at, it is really interesting because I suspect a lot of the reasons, particularly if one is a tourist somewhere. If I go back to the Louvre as a really good example, you kind of go. A lot of people are going because they have to. Right?
Right.
They're probably not going. Yay! I'm really looking forward to it. It does become, in some
It's
respects, because of peer pressure, it can become closer to a school trip where
right.
you're
Right.
dragged to something. You will look at this stuff, and you go, "I will
Right.
not look at this stuff." Right? Kind of thing. And so you've got them through the door, but actually,
Yeah.
how does one turn that thing? So I think all of this points to sort of expectations, perceptions,
Yeah.
and it comes back to none of this is logical.
Right.
None of this
Right.
follows any strict patterns, which makes your job interesting,
Right.
I guess really hard. Because
Yeah.
this brings us to the classic territory of the reasons people say they do things and
Hmm.
the reasons they actually do them. And
Right.
particularly with social media now, we know that narrative of like the nicely stylized, Instagrammable life versus
Exactly.
reality. A ton of people are going to museums to take pictures of having been to the museum
Yeah.
without any great thought of looking forward to it. But the photo, the Kodak moment, to use that
It's
terminology, is
yeah,
what
it's the
is what
social
matters.
currency of documenting your presence within the great, arts of the civilizations or the experiences. Yeah, absolutely. It gets even more complicated than that though,
Love
which
it.
is what's delightful because and Lucy has a mechanism for this, which we could talk about, like the framework for behavioral science and choosing exhibits. But even if you were able to isolate the variables of grandma wants this, grandchild wants this, dad wants that, it's still not a perfect science because I, as a human being, am constantly evolving. And so even me on a Tuesday is different than me on a Saturday. And Joe Pine talks about this all the time in his transformation economy, experience economy work. And I experienced this firsthand because the Barnes Foundation, I don't know if you know it, it's
Yeah,
in
yeah, yeah,
Philadelphia,
Philadelphia. Yeah.
gorgeous, gorgeous space.
I mean,
It's
ridiculous in a way because you go into a room and I've never seen so many paintings in one.
exactly, it's
Like,
manic, right? There's
yeah,
stuff everywhere. And because of that exact framework, there's hundreds of paintings on the wall, except for instead of 3, the way a normal museum would be built. Every time I go there, I see something completely different because I'm a different person. I'm looking through the lens of I'm on a date, I want to impress someone, or I'm more romantic right now, or I'm more depressed, and so it's a different lens that me myself am constantly looking through, and so that's where it becomes like, okay, you just have to create enough bridges that no matter where you are, no matter who you are, no matter what you're doing, you can create an entry point. And so what Lucy has done is sort of map out on a matrix all of the experiences that we are planning on creating within an environment. And on the other axis, all of the different personas, need states, things that we've understood. And and we plot what we reference is, Daniel Kahneman's peak end rule. And this idea that you're only going to remember the good thing and the last thing. So through the lens of grandma or through the lens of the, dinosaur geek, what is going to be the moment that's going to be like, wow, this is, I'll never forget this. This is my imprint moment, as AJ, our CEO says. And so you plot that in the scatter plot of, okay, this experience is going to resonate with this person, that one, that one. And you see it and you take a step back and you realize that there are some experiences that a lot of people are going to get excited about and others that are outliers. But as long as there's enough of a scatter, you can feel safe that there's some good, traction here. And what those outliers show is that if there's a space where a lot of people are going to be excited, you can invest more money in that because it can be more robust. It's going to have to be, survive the test of time. And then for the outlier stuff, you can decide, do I invest in this? Do I skip it? Do I turn it into programming events, a one-off thing that happens in a season that you can sort of delight in? And then it's only for that, that particular group of people. And it sort of objectifies the questions because all of this stuff, again, right? Your subject matter experts, passions, like how do you make these hard choices? You have a limited budget, limited real estate. Where am I going to invest? And that's the stuff that you can hint at. And you hope that you get 80% there and it resonates with the community. And that's where going back and doing, field research and evaluations can really unlock the gap in intelligence there. So those are that's the mushy stuff. The rational stuff that I would really fight against and say that, you know what, like no matter what, this is true and we can hold this as sacred is hearing from communities. I'm afraid to go into a museum because I don't understand it myself. And I'm afraid that if my son asks me a question, I'm not going to know how to answer it. So I'd rather just not go. And that's the two world we're living in, recognizing that there are profound barriers to even getting through the door that we have to hold as sacred and precious and really wrestle with those topics. And then the mushiness of is this gonna land once they're there? It's brutal. It is a brutal business that is so delightful and such a love, but very, very hard.
I love that, and I hadn't really thought it's interesting. I guess not having kids partly that helps explain this, but it
Mm,
hadn't really sort of occurred to me what you might term an embarrassment factor. If you said
sure.
to me, museums are embarrassing," I would think embarrassing in the sense of hasn't been updated, is telling a false narrative, that
Right,
pushes a
right.
political point. It wouldn't occur to me that it would be embarrassing to go there because I walk
Mm,
in with a childlike ignorance, but I do that based on the privilege of my education. I'm not
right,
having to explain to anyone else, right? So if I come out and I just I didn't understand any of that, it doesn't matter. In fact, I might make a joke of it, right? And just sort of,
right.
I just went to this completely incomprehensible nonsense, right? Isn't that funny? But I could totally see your point.
Yeah,
It becomes an accessibility point, and I think that's a really it's cognitive accessibility
right.
in a way that I might not understand, or I might misunderstand. It's possibly even not even just not understand. I might misunderstand. Like look, but it's that sense of I will look like an idiot.
Mhm.
And I think that's a really, as we look at human emotions, I think often we underestimate things like fear, embarrassment,
Shame.
those sorts of social
Yeah,
emotions.
completely.
They get downplayed through, but they're huge drive. In my work, those are huge drivers of how people behave. I'm
Yeah,
too embarrassed to ask that question.
right.
It's an amazing question, but you don't think it is, and you think everybody else knows because you've been conditioned to that. And so that's really interesting when you look at those questions because as I say, I'm coming at this from a very privileged position of I normally go to museums. I know what the form is.
Yeah.
I can afford to make a fool of myself from time to time. And actually, from a sort of experiential thing, the more of a fool I make of myself, right, the more content I potentially get from my work. So the ditto for
Exactly.
you, right? Good news, right? If it's a sort of monotony, the sort of plain vanilla experience,
Mhm.
not as interesting as something's gone a bit wild, crazy ass sign, this doesn't make sense, right? Or even I've turned up on a day when they're not open, right? Because I'm
Right,
an idiot.
right.
Right? All of those
Yeah,
things adds to the general gaiety of my life. But
sure.
I think that is incredibly interesting. And so as you're mapping all these things out, I can see that again, back to the sort of the curse of passion. It's
Mhm.
challenging for them to see that. So you're really opening that new thing. But you're having to play kind of like there's 6 or 7 or probably more than that, right? I'm summarizing the dimensions that you have to think
Oh,
about
yeah.
here.
No, myriad, yeah. We've co-opted Walt Whitman's, beautiful poetry of Song of Myself where, he says, "I contain multitudes." Lucy says, "We embody multitudes," because we have to really sort of get into everyone's head, and what that really creates is an opportunity to think multisensorial, to think about universal design and ADA accessibility and all of those things, and recognize sort of the how things land is very, very different for everyone. So, yeah. But, to the point of embarrassment and shame and complexity, to go back to the earlier comment about museums are the most trusted institutions in the world, you sort of take them as gospel in some way. I went to a museum once with my son that had an exhibit on the benefits of fracking, and I was sort of flabbergasted, and Marcel was like, "What?"
But yeah, that's just made me think actually. So if I think about there are certain religions that have museums, right? So
Mhm.
the way you come into our visitor center, right? So very innocuous language for potentially nefarious purposes. And then I think back to it's one of the reasons when I was a banking regulator, I used to love go, particularly in the US, where this is more prevalent than elsewhere. Is you go to head office for like the US banks or in the UK. And I would always make a thing of going, can I have a look around your, and I'd make sure I knew what the term was, but it's either
Yeah.
Heritage Center or there's
Oh,
some sort of thing,
sure.
right? And
Yeah.
they take you through, and there's a certain US bank that I'm not going to name, but you will know the one I'm talking about, with the one with the horse and carriages, right? Right? They have a like a museum thing, and you go through and it talks about the values that we stand by, and all this kind of like, and
Right.
it's nice, right? Because I think there's something this there's a you could argue there's a well-intentioned argument, and then there's the nefarious, right? This is propaganda central talking story. And I always used to love going around those because as a regulator, I would sort of go, I'd make a note of all the things that were at odds with the
Oh,
values that they were
sure.
thinking. And so they'd have the the original statute.
Right.
And you'd say, well, oh, that's interesting because you're making a thing about it, and I noticed it in your heritage center, right? Right, so deploying it as a weapon against them, but it was also just
Right.
fascinating to see as a propaganda exercise. And so that's a really interesting, as I
Yeah.
think about your space, you're absolutely right, is we kind of go and we assume that these dinosaur bones genuinely are what they say. And the I guess as we think about and art's an interesting one because there's no right or wrong answer there to a certain extent. So that's a bit easier. But when you're talking about
Yeah.
history or science, factual museums, for want of a better
Sure.
phrase, I'm sure you've got a more sophisticated term for it, then that
Right.
is an interesting point, right?
Yeah.
And right, reflecting that. And I guess to some extent, if one sets up a museum, it's funded for a particular reason. The
Sure.
trustees have particular expectations that it will fulfill a particular purpose, but that could stray into propaganda very easily.
Absolutely, especially with complex topics. One of the most gorgeous exercises in creating checks and balances for this was the work that I had the pleasure of doing on this Jewish museum in Moscow. First ever Jewish museum in Moscow in Russia, period. And we assembled a team of 12 scholars. Now, if you think about the minutia and the funnel of like people who are experts in Judaism within the lens of Russia, the Soviet Union, Moscow, right? I mean, you're talking about a handful of people on the planet. They all know each other. They all hate each other because they're all like slightly interpreting the
Right,
knowledge
because they need a unique angle, right? Otherwise, there's no
exactly,
academic career, right?
or hyper specialize. I'm gonna only look at like this particular moment through this lens of and we had got them in a room together for a year and a half and just had them battle it out. And only the things that they could all collectively agree on did we put in that museum. And it was kind of this amazing thing of seeing,
Got one room, right?
yeah,
One
yeah,
exhibit.
wow, wow, yeah, no, it was really incredible. But it opened up a lot of windows into how complex documenting a shared experience is, right? And how nuanced these histories are. So I thought that was beautiful. I was like, this is why I'm in this business. Like to be able to like preserve that knowledge in a way that really feels like we've done due diligence on this. And yeah, absolutely incredible. But yeah, who knows if we got it wrong, right? Like it's just you try as much as you can to like get that story correct.
But it's interesting as well when you think about those things because it's sort of there's what you put in, but by default, that's a choice as to what you've left out.
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, I mean that's actually the one time in my career that I walked out on my job for a bit. I the part of that museum that talked about the Holocaust. You know, you've got two walls. You have to tell this story. And as a museum, you are faced with the burden of choosing which photos go in that museum. And you're going through these archives and you know, Yad Vashem and all these things, and you've got hundreds and hundreds of documentations of people who have been completely their lives destroyed. And you're like, okay, what are the three good photos that we can put in here? How do you even make that decision? Like, how do you say your picture doesn't get shown because we don't have enough real estate? This one is going to capture this story better. I was out of my mind. I walked out of my office. It was like so hard. And so you could say, okay, let's use the joy of technology and bridge that gap and have a database of all these photos you could scroll through. Who wants to scroll through that? Who is like gonna flip through Holocaust photos? Like it's like it's this world of like what is the burden of duty of documenting and sharing this, And what the New York Times called tragedy porn in the 9/11 museum.
That's astonishing. And so what you're pointing towards here is the challenges of curation,
Hmm.
particularly where there's and I guess this is going to get harder, right? As we look at, there are more greater amounts of sources available.
Right.
We should know more about things. We may need to tell the history of interpretation of a subject. So with it's not, we can't just sort of show the latest thinking. We may need to bring some history. So as we look
Right.
at that, none of this stuff is going to get any easier. And then I'm struck
Right.
by the point you're making, and I'm really thinking about this sort of framework, how you cut the demographic, and demographic is probably not going to get there either, because age
Right.
is not necessarily, or social demographic is not necessarily always going to be the answer, right? That
Right.
hence you have all these the potential to different personas, I guess, to look at it. I mean, this topic doesn't get easier, and I
Nope.
would have thought, as my initial reaction to this stuff is, well, this is good. We're learning, right, and we learn how to design spaces that are more flexible.
Right.
It's after the pandemic, right? So we started to see what post-pandemic world looks like. So this should be getting easier. But as you're explaining it, the level of complexity is just getting greater, right? This is tougher and tougher
Absolutely.
and tougher in
But
a
but
world where there's less and less funding, right? So let's add that into the
yeah,
mix.
absolutely. Sure. Sure. I think though that in some ways it makes it easier if you surrender the role of a museum, right? If we go back to this point of let's let's lean into passion, let's lean into joy, let's lean into the magic of learning. We are emotional creatures. We make decisions based on memory. We make decisions based on our hearts. Um, what does it mean to just choose and curate an experience that sets your heart on fire, knowing that when you get home, you'll do the work of finding out the truth or digging out the 700 different books that you could see different lanes and chase that for yourself, because within 300 square meters or 5,000 square feet or whatever space we have, you're not going to be able to tackle that all. It's there are worlds within worlds within worlds. So let's use it to create magic and curiosity and joy, and then let them carry it on afterwards.
And creating curiosity, I think, is interesting. And it kind of, I guess, it deals with the expert challenge as well, right?
Mhm.
Because you come in and you say, we can never cover everything, right? So by default, don't expect us to have covered all the detail. That's not what we're about, right? And if you want to do
Right.
that, go buy the books and go research the stuff on.
Right.
So you can kind of deal with that sort of, I don't like your summary of this thing. And you go, well, that's fine, right? It's not for you almost.
Right.
But
Right.
that sparking curiosity thing is interesting, because that requires you to think, I guess, much more viscerally,
Hmm.
much harder to codify. And again, I guess what might spark person A's curiosity might not be person B's. But if
Right.
that's your challenge, that's
Right.
really interesting from a behavioral perspective, because you're putting yourselves in the role of, it's almost like the teacher that has to inspire their pupils,
Right.
and to think about what is it like. It doesn't matter. It kind of doesn't matter what I'm interested in. How do I get them interested in getting them
Right.
to ask and almost leave questions unanswered? Because if I think about curiosity, is if I've got an answer to a question, I can move on. So you kind of
Right.
need to leave enough hanging there
Right.
that I continue to be curious about the stuff. I want to go and read those books, right? It
Right.
helps the museum store as well, I guess, right? I want to buy the book to learn more about this thing because you've got me on it. So
Right.
that's one heck of a behavioral challenge.
So absolutely. And I think that right, our job is to create the mechanism to spark that curiosity, right? Or to incite a change. So working on the Lego house was one of the peaks of my
I
career.
really wanna go to that. I went to Billund
Yeah.
before it was built, and
Oh gosh.
I
Yeah.
keep tripping, and it's the trouble
Truly a
is, right.
one cow town.
Well,
It's
that's the
amazing.
funny thing, right? Is anybody that's not been there, it's literally in the middle of Denmark. There is an airport there, I think,
Yeah,
built precisely by Lego, and so
exactly.
it's not hard to get to, but as a rail man, right,
Yeah.
I cannot be seen to be flying there these days. I have to get on the train, and I'm like, I don't have any unless I do work for Lego, I've got no reason to go there. So
Yeah.
I'm jealous, right? Tell us more.
Yeah.
Anyway, Lego
No, it's
house, right?
amazing, amazing. And what I discovered is, like, when you boil down Lego to its core essence, Lego is a language. It is not a toy. It is not a thing, because we can use it for anything. People build robots with it. They make art. You name it, right? And so I took that with me years after working on that project, and I was hired by a hospital to create their visitor, like the lobby spaces of the children's hospital. And what you realize very quickly is that those spaces are not designed for the patients. They're designed for the families that are stuck in the hospital for hours and hours on end because the kid's in the hospital bed, right? And so you're really designing for like the siblings or the cousins or and we did this workshop and we asked the kids, tell me your worst or happiest memory about being in a hospital. Silence, crickets, like could not get anything out of these kids. So we went back a month later and I brought all my Lego and I dumped it on the table and I said, build me your favorite memory of the hospital or worst memory of the hospital. And all of a sudden, these kids would not shut up. And because they weren't talking about their experience, they were talking about what they built. And so it became this MacGuffin for them to share and unload all of these experiences and become completely vulnerable. Because just these little square things, which you could never tell what they were, right? Was a bridge for them to sort of unlock all of this incredible stuff that we used to build a much more compelling experience for them. And like that's like those are the behavioral science, if you call that behavioral science moments that are just like, wow, this is so exciting to see how you can change things. Same thing with the Cleveland Museum of Art. Jane Alexander's a genius. She's been at the forefront of making art approachable for museums in ways that like no one in the planet is doing. And, so my agency was brought on to design the Art Lens experience. And you think about how intimidating art is, right? You can't, like, no one, like, yeah, I can't admit that I don't understand a Jackson Pollock. I'm just not going to go to the museum, so you avoid that. So she unlocked this idea of like, let's gamify art and let's create games where you can like strike the pose of the model that's in the painting and get a score on how accurate you are. Or and so we built all this stuff with her and we co-created and you see these people in the museum now making utter knuckleheads of themselves because they're like balancing on one leg and then no one in their right mind would do that in public in a museum as a stuffy institution, right? But you create the mechanisms that suddenly it becomes safe to do that in public and be delighted by it. So there really are real hacks that if you can crack it, become magical, in these spaces. As long as you really understand, to your point, like getting rid of shame or getting rid of embarrassment or creating like magic or wonder, we can't just help get sucked into this thing. It's fascinating.
And I'm thinking about that and kind of disruptive. I guess that's disrupting a norm, right? So you come to
Right, right.
one of the stereotypes of museums is you go and quite silently contemplate this piece of art
Exactly.
that's in front of
Slowly
you.
stroll until
Yeah,
you're back.
yeah, yeah. Don't do anything. And so you're subverting that norm. And
Right,
I'm thinking back to your comment around protests
right.
and thinking about what's happening, what we see happening now in these spaces. And so obviously there's a risk of theft.
Yeah,
But we're also seeing people protesting there. And so we've seen
right.
people, throwing paint over.
Cans of soup. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah, and those kinds of things. So when one thinks about designing, you can do lots of things with the space, but there's also risks posed by the nature of the space that I guess you also have to think of.
right, right. Yeah, and that's where the operational lens comes in. So I think that's where I am incredibly grateful for spending, 6 years in the retail and hospitality and brand and culture world, because during those years, the lens was not what's the story, what's the thing. It's like, how do I make money?
Right.
And so, I got to design Tiffany's flagship redesign in New York, and that was like
I
years and
love the way you just drop this in,
like
like
crazy, like
like
yeah,
it's
yeah,
perfect.
years of like, but yeah, the team that worked on that did all kinds of stuff. We had so many radical ideas, and as we were doing that master plan, we were wrestling with all these issues. But what we saw is that in that world, unlike if you, as long as you curate a good story, build it and get it on the wall, your job is done. In the real world of retail, what's happening is that you're changing a behavior, you're changing a framework. Now you have to affects your operations, it affects your storage, your delivery, all those things. It affects who and how people interact with your store. And now you have to change the behaviors of the staff there because now they're expected to function differently. And so you get like all of these layers of things you're wrestling with. And w- one of the most genius people I've ever worked with, Elena Eversole, she said, experience is the only place where everything comes together. So in an organization, you've got your marketing guy and your ops guy and your logistics guy, and they're all like in their little silos, their own little budgets, their own little worlds doing their thing. And all of a sudden you come in, you're like, wouldn't it be cool if there was a button you could hit and the shoe would fall out of the sky and you'd get it like served up to you? And everyone's like, whoa, that's awesome. But now you've just disrupted everyone's lives. You got like the logistics guy's got to build a new supply chain. You got a he's got a you got a new hire of the guy who's got to like touch the shoe. Like it's complete chaos. And so enrolling all of those people into an organization and to affect an experiential change is bananas. And so ultimately, what you end up seeing is that often an experience reflects the siloification, if that's a word, of
It is
the
now.
organization,
Right.
right? Of like, because if you can't get those people to co-work together, it's just a mess. And it goes through any museum, right? Like you've got your different departments, you got your Asian American art, you've got your, modern art, like they've all got different budgets, they've got different curators. Like it's something that requires such a collaboration that really, yeah, it's one of the hardest jobs I think I've ever seen.
Wow. I can keep talking to you forever. I'm conscious of
Yeah.
time. But before I let
Yeah,
you
yeah.
go, the first thing I obviously have to ask you is for your favorite museums and museum recommendations. Maybe some things we wouldn't have heard of.
Ooh, interesting. I think one of my favorites, which I think is a fan favorite for all the sort of people in the museum world, is the Tenement Museum, which I've also had the luxury of working on. It's if you've never been to it, it's on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. It's literally just a block of old apartment buildings that were purchased, and you take a tour to them, and you just hear the stories of the people who live there. And there's no artifacts, there's no anything. You're just literally in these people's houses, and you've got a hell of a storyteller giving you the context of what it was like to be an immigrant in New York at any given time. And it is a gem of a space. Oh my goodness. Really, really sacred. Because you talk about empathy, like you just suddenly meet people where they are in a really special way. My other favorite, which is delightful, is I believe I have known it maybe through the English translation of like micropia, which is in Amsterdam. There's a bacteria and like microbe
Oh,
museum,
yeah, yeah.
and you go around and you get this like petri dish, and you stamp like a passport of all the funk you find around the tour, and then at the end you scan it and it shows you all the things you've collected. It's just like what a delightfully bizarre niche of thing to talk about, like right, like because you realize again, like we think we're people, but we're really just a collection of like foul looking things that you can't see. That your girlfriend, your wife is really just 200,000 microorganisms like glued together.
Complex microorganisms that we don't always understand.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. So that was
Wow.
really like
Okay, that's
such a
perfect. I'll put
yeah.
links to both of those in the show. What great recommendations. I love that. Amazing. And if people want to find out more about, see some of the work that you do, where can they go look at this?
So our website is Luci Creative, Luci creative.com. And yeah, we get stuff all over. And my own personal website is MatthewMcNerney.com. You can sure no one can spell my name, but you can put that on there. And yeah, it's just delightful. And we show up at all the conferences and thought leadership things, and we're out there. So
I love it. Do you know what? There's something amazing about talking to people that just one, love what they do, and two, are ideally suited to what they do. And those two things typically go hand in hand. And you clearly, I'm really jealous because I spent I think I found my niche that works
right.
well for me. But I'm kind of like you. You just fell straight into it with limited effort. So I'm insanely jealous, but I'm also delighted because I'm like, that's what the world should be about, is people
Yeah.
able to find their home
Right.
really easily, quickly, effortlessly slide it, and then just be amazing at it, which will naturally happen. And you
Yeah.
clearly are because you approach it with just the way you talk about it, right? It's just
Yeah.
absolutely infectious. And you make me want to get off my butt and go to a museum. So I will probably go do that, given we're recording this on a
Yeah.
Saturday, and I'm grateful to you for
Yeah.
spending time on a Saturday. Time I could have spent in a museum, obviously, Matthew, but I will now go rectify that, go
Yeah,
off.
yeah,
But
yeah.
thank you for all those,
Yeah.
like, just for being
No worries.
inspirational and amazing. I love your content. We've communicated loads on LinkedIn and kind
Yeah,
of
yeah.
shared
Let's make
ideas and
stand up
stuff.
for stuff. Yeah.
Hopefully, there'll be more of that to come. But
Yeah.
above all, right now, thank you for being such a great
Yeah.
guest on the show.
Thank you. It's lovely. No, this is my icky guy, as the Japanese would say. Absolutely. But yeah, to round that out, like this is, I think I didn't even realize this until I was speaking to you. This idea of passion being the most important thing. But one of my favorite quotes of all time, Howard Thurman: "Don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive. Because what the world needs is people who come alive." It's like, imagine like what an amazing world if we can like just everyone's just pumped about their thing and like we're all just leaning in. Like, yes, you got your trains, you got your hats, I got my, yeah, clients. Like,
Totally
you know,
amazing. Matthew, thank you so much for
they're
being a
good.
fabulous guest and a top man.
Thank you so much, Christian. All right.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Matthew for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Matthew, his work at Luci, and to see some of the examples of the work that he's done, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. If you enjoyed this episode, you might also enjoy an episode featuring Dr. Tom Schussler, who at the time of recording in 2020 was running a museum in Bremen, Germany, where they conducted a very unique experiment to try and get more people to visit the museum. It's fascinating and goes nicely alongside this episode. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, thank you so much for joining me. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you like the show and have yet to leave a review for it, please do so. It really, really does help. And to discover some of the over 300 episodes of the show that you might have missed, have a look at the show's website, which is humanriskpodcast.com. I will be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, stay safe, try visiting a museum you've never been to before, you never know, and thank you so much for listening.